Please be seated.
Well, truth be told, there has never been a sermon I felt less prepared to preach than this one. That should encourage you. And the reason is because the subject matter is so incredibly big. And because there have been so many studies over the last probably 85 years or so that have been so diverse, so divergent of people saying, I can tell you what the Bible is all about. And they have their own little system and their own key. And I've read many of these books. You can go into my office and find on the library shelf there books written by very scholarly, conservative, scholarly men who will tell you that the Bible is written around a plan of promise, or the Bible is written around the redemption of the world, or it's all about a king and a kingdom. And because of that, because the subject matter is so broad and so vast, you just feel inadequate. You read all these materials, you read, of course, the Bible itself, and you're left, if you're like me, you feel inadequate. A number of years ago, I sat in a class called Old Testament Critical Issues, and here is what we discussed. Are you ready? This was my week. This is pretty exciting. Feminism, creation theories, various theologies by scholars, conservative and liberal. Somebody did a study on a guy whose name I can't even pronounce, and it was just so strange. You get to the end. In fact, I went back over it today and looked at it this afternoon and went, yep, it's just as strange as when I saw it a few years ago. Of course, we talked about the ethical codes that are in the Old Testament and various aspects of Judaism that are in the Old Testament. But you know what? We never really answered the question. Here it is. Here's the question. What is the Old Testament? What is it? I mean, you have it in your hands. And for some of you, you've been saved, and some of you have even taught the Bible for years. How would you answer that question? What is the Old Testament? Well, that wasn't really answered in the class I was taking. Now, I believe the Old Testament is the working and interaction of Israel with covenants that God has made with her, how they broke these covenants, and God's judgment over them. That's pretty much the Old Testament. But all of that is part of a larger system that emphasizes the promises of God made to His people, made to Adam and Eve, made to Noah, made to Abraham and David and to Moses. You have all of these promises. But I think they are foundational to one covenant God made to Abraham, where He promised him a land, a seed, and a blessing. Now, our English Bible begins with Genesis. Actually, it wasn't the first book written by Moses. That was Leviticus. Genesis comes along, and to understand Genesis well, you probably ought to have some working knowledge of Leviticus, because there are some, I think, assumptions being made of the reader of Genesis. You've already read Leviticus. And when you read Genesis, you find these 11 stories. The word in the King James translation is generations. In Hebrew, it's toledot. But it's the generation of Adam, the generation of Terah, but it's really the story of Abraham. He's the third of these stories, but it just tells these stories of these families and how God worked with these families. And then you get to Exodus all the way through Judges, and you find the family of Abraham. Really, it's his son, his grandson Jacob, who's renamed Israel, and his family that's now in Egypt, coming out of Egypt and coming to a land of promise, a land that God gave to their patriarch father Abraham. And then, of course, you have the period of the kings, and you have from Kings to Chronicles, you have these stories of these kings, many of whom were really godless men. In the middle of all this, you have this poetry section, which teaches us really God's love for us and man's aspiration for Him, or good Christian, godly followers of God, aspiration for God. And then there are the prophets. And there are prophets who wrote on two sides of a great divide called the Exile. The northern kingdom's lost in the 8th century BC. The southern kingdom is destroyed by the Babylonians. They're kind of swallowed up by the Persians. And then they're released and sent back to their homeland. But they're never really fully a nation. And I will say today, they aren't really fully a nation because they don't have the whole land. And so you have the prophets on the early side of the exile in the 8th and 7th centuries, maybe even part of the 9th century BC. They are calling Israel to come back to covenant keeping, come back to the covenant promise. That's what they're doing. And then after the exile, that the years where they're wandering, the prophets are trying to encourage them to reestablish the forms of worship that they were supposed to have, that God established for them. So what is the Old Testament? I think that the theme of the Old Testament is the glory of God and its creation, a story of redemption, war with Satan, and preparation for Messiah. It contains two parts. The first part's really short, of which we have almost no information. That's the part between Adam and Noah. And I'll just tell you that regardless of what Ken Ham says, we don't know a lot about that period of time. All right? We just don't. And then after that period of time, of which is the majority of the Old Testament, from really Abraham or post-flood, we have then all the way to about 400 years before Jesus, we have all of this writing. And there's so many truths that are being emphasized in the Old Testament. God's sovereignty over mankind, man's sinfulness. Wow, isn't that there? I read one guy this week, and you know what he said, or this was actually last week I was reading him. He said, the Old Testament is a really dark book. And I will tell you, if you actually read the Old Testament, particularly in a really modern version, the King James makes it sound so nice and clinical, okay? You read it and it just feels almost, even when it's bad, it's good, okay? But when you read in a modern English translation what's happening, especially books like Ezekiel, that's really gritty, Hosea, pretty gritty stuff that's going on there in those pre-exilic books. It's some of the stuff would be hard to read even in church or in mixed company. It's difficult because it's such a dark book. The Old Testament talks about blood sacrifice for sin and a land of promise for chosen people. And of course, the good parts, a Savior who will come to save his people from their sins, who we find out later is going to be Jesus in the New Testament, and then a kingdom for his people. So what I want to do tonight is do this. I want to answer the question, what is the Old Testament? And we're going to begin in Hebrews chapter 1. So turn over to Hebrews chapter 1, which is really strange because you thought I would go to the Old Testament first. But we're going to start in Hebrews because there's a statement that opens the book of Hebrews that is really helpful for us to understand what the Old Testament is. Here's the first verse, and this is the only verse we're going to consider from this book. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners, and that just simply means at various times and in various ways, spoke in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. The Old Testament is the revelation of God to man. That's what God's doing. He presumes that he exists. He doesn't really try to prove that. And he reveals himself. He pulls back the curtain on himself and says, come and observe me. Come look at me. In fact, what you find here is that God is the author of Scripture. God, he says, spoke. Everything begins with God's revelation. You would know very little about God without the Bible. You would almost know nothing of him. But God reveals himself in his word. In fact, it's interesting, in the book of Hebrews, the name of God, or the word God, theos, is mentioned some 68 times, which, by the way, is kind of an unusual usage. Usually in the New Testament books, they're talking about Jesus. But here it's written to the Hebrews. And so the book centers on God. And it's interesting that the book almost opens so similarly to Genesis 1, right? So in the beginning, God, and here we have God who in times past, kind of a similar kind of construction where God is revealing himself even as he did creatively in Genesis, he's revealing himself verbally in the Old Testament. And this is because, of course, it was written to these Christian Jews, the original recipients of the book of Hebrews, which ought to really control the way we interpret the book. And just as an aside, for an example, there are 5 warnings or so in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews itself is a sermon that somebody preached and was written down and published. We don't really know who preached it. We don't really know who wrote it. And there are lots of guesses out there, and I won't go through them. I will tell you that it has these warnings against sliding back. And well-meaning evangelistic preachers have taken that to mean backsliding. And the word backsliding today has the idea, well, I once was living for Christ and doing what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not doing that anymore. I'm backsliding. But understand that the book was written to the Hebrews. Backsliding for them was sliding back into Judaism. So if you understand that as kind of a controlling or limiting feature of the book, when it talks about backsliding in this book, it's actually saying, don't go back into your old religion. Stay with Christ. He's better. And that's kind of what the writer of Hebrews is teaching. But we have this fundamental assumption that's being made that there is a God and that he has revealed himself. And I'll just tell you, for me, that's my apologetic right there. Where I begin is that there is a God and he's revealed himself. James Sire, who wrote the book The Universe Next Door, some of you have read that book. You've heard it mentioned more than once from this pulpit or maybe in one of the classes we've had here at the church. Sire begins with, he has these 7 questions, and the first is, what is the real? I mean, what's real? And then he answers that question as God. I don't actually start there. I think Sire's beginning point is wrong. I will say this. The starting point is there is a God, and the second point is that he's revealed himself. And everything begins there. And if you understand that, then I don't really have to convince a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist that this is true. It's true. And I believe that it's true. If they believe it or not, that's between them and God. I hope they believe it, and I would hope that I could convince them that it's true, but I don't have to, because it's true. It's like trying to convince somebody that the sky is blue and not pink with brown polka dots. You know, that's because you got kicked in the head by a donkey. That's why you think it looks like that. So there is a God and he's revealed himself. Now, it's interesting here. He says God spoke. Notice, in time past, at sundry times, in divers manners. So he revealed himself at various times. Did you know the Old Testament comprises about 1,000 years of revelatory history? It took 1,000 years to write the Old Testament. Now we joke about reading J.R.R. Tolkien's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. It's about 1,000 pages. Yeah, but it didn't take him 1,000 years to write. You know, that's a book. This is a book. It took 1,000 years and 40 different authors writing this book. That's really incredible. That those many people are contributing. It takes that period of time all to get this book. And God revealed himself in different modes. I mean, he used prophets, right? You've got Haggai, and you've got Zechariah, and you've got Samuel, good old Samuel, and Elijah, and he's revealing himself through these men. He used dreams. He used something called the Umim and the Thummim, and nobody really is fully sure what that means, but somehow he used those things. Angelic messengers. And angels are messengers. I think they're the way God answers our prayers, and I believe that's one of the big ways that God revealed himself to people is through angelic messages. Visions, and even face-to-face. God sometimes, as the angel of the Lord, put on human flesh and came down. The pre-incarnate Christ came down and spoke to people one-on-one. You have Abraham talking to the angels before the destruction of Sodom. He revealed himself in different methods. You have in the Old Testament, if you look at it as a Jewish book, They call it the Tanakh. And the Tanakh, if you've never heard this before, now you're going to learn something, okay? The Tanakh is divided up into three parts. This is the Jewish Old Testament, contains the Torah. That's the law. Those are the first 5 books, just like we have Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's the Torah. Then they have something called the Nevi'im. And the Nevi'im, Nevi is the word for prophet. It's the Hebrew word for prophet, and Nevi'im is the prophets. And it's not necessarily the way we delineate the prophets in our Bible, but that's their section. And then they end with the Ketuvim, called the writings. Torah, Nevim, Ketuvim, T-N-K, Tanakh. Okay? So when they say Tanakh, they mean the Jewish Old Testament. You just go, oh, you mean the Old Testament. Okay, that's the Tanakh, that's the Old Testament. It's interesting, by the way, they ended 2 Chronicles. That's their last book. Our last book is Malachi. Now, God used different methods. And by the way, what he was doing in all this, notice here in verse 1 again, he spoke through all these different means and modes and methods to the fathers by these prophets. So the fathers were the early leaders of the Jews. You go back to the patriarchs, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then all obviously to David and others, Samuel. He spoke to them by the prophets, by the early writers of the Old Testament, Moses and others. So when you have a guy like David come along and write Psalm 1, blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. He's talking about Genesis through Deuteronomy, maybe including Joshua, possibly including Judges, but probably not. Okay? Those 5, maybe 6 books, that's all he's talking about. And he says, boy, if you just meditate on those books, you'll be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bring forth its fruit in season. And you can trace through the Old Testament this idea of a tree planted by water. Throughout, it's in Jeremiah, I believe it's in Isaiah. You have other places where God talks about this tree. It's in the Psalms where you have this tree. And it's really neat to see. So God is speaking to the fathers. He's revealing himself. That's what the Old Testament is. It is the revelation of God to mankind, to people. So if you believe that, I hope you believe that. If you believe that, then the next question you have to say in answering the question, what is the Old Testament, is, well, what does it say? Right? What does it say? It's my dad had a thing he would do. I've told you this probably before. People would call our house, back we had old landline phones, thing hanging on the wall. You see it in museums these days, but you pulled it off the wall, had a little circular cord that for some reason they could not invent one that wouldn't tangle. But they would be all tangled up. You pull it off, and people would call our house, and it'd be a wrong number, and they would say, and just give a name, Samantha, right? Is she there? And my dad would say, no, Samantha's not here, which is true. Samantha, we didn't know a Samantha. And so he would, and then the person on the other line, well, if Samantha comes in, would you leave her a message? And my dad would say, if Samantha comes in, I will leave her a message, right? And he would write a message, Tom, call Samantha when you get in, or Samantha, call Tom, or whatever. And it would be on our fridge. He would actually put it on the fridge. And I go, Dad. So, we would talk sometimes, and he would say, I was talking to this person. Have you ever had a conversation like this? Somebody says, I was talking to this person. And they keep talking about talking to the person. And at some point you just go, well, what did that person say? Because the fact that you talked to him is great, but I want to know the information that was exchanged. That's more important to me. And so understanding that the Old Testament is the revelation of God, that's good. But really we have to know, what is God saying? Because that's what's most important here. And for that, I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 12. Because this is however long after the flood. Nobody's fully sure. A few hundred years, maybe 100 years. Some people think it's just a few years, but some people go as many as 300 years after the flood. But here you have, actually back in chapter 11, in verse 27, these are the generations of Terah, but this really is the story of Abraham. And if I were to say, what does the Old Testament say, and I had to put it into one idea, if I had to whittle it down, boil it down to one concept, I would say it's this. It's all about this covenant that God makes with Abraham. So let me say it this way. This is my point number 2. God's revelation focuses on his covenant with Abraham. And you find it in the first few verses of chapter 12. Now the Lord said unto Abram, get out of thy country and from thy kindred, from thy father's house to a land I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That's really an incredible promise that God makes to Abram. You understand, Abram had no family. He had Sarah, but he had no children. He's about 75 years old, so he's probably not expecting to have children. I don't think many 75-year-olds are painting one of the rooms to look like a nursery at the house. That's just kind of not how 75-year-olds think. I don't think. But this covenant that God's making with Abram, it's foundational to everything else that comes after it. It's foundational to the covenantal system of the Old Testament. Now, you'll see here in verse 1, God said to Abram, okay, leave Ur. That's where he lived. Leave Ur and go to where I will tell you, and I will make you a great nation. A land I will show you. Verse 2, I will make you a great nation. So Genesis is God's revealing himself to Israel in various times. This writing, Moses is writing this down as they're about to invade Canaan. In various manners, a collection of these 11 people, family stories, the Toledoth, the generations, in various methods. Most of this part of the book is stories. It's not law giving like you're going to get in Leviticus. It's stories. It's narrative. And it's written to the fathers, the Exodus generation, and the writer is Moses. So this is what God's doing. If we take what we learned in Hebrews 1 and we apply it now to what we're learning here, this is what's happening. At the beginning of the Canaanite invasion, God is recounting to his people, revealing to his people how he created the world, how he called Abram to come out from Ur of the Chaldees and come to a land that he would promise to give him. And it's interesting. This is the crucial part of the story. Because everything's going to build off of this covenant. And I think if you're reading this and you're about to invade Canaan, you almost can say, I'm not taking a land that doesn't belong to me. I'm retaking a land that does belong to me. Right? Isn't that kind of what Moses is saying here? So here we have this crucial part of the Old Testament on which everything's going to be built. And I'll just tell you, dispensationally, it's a new dispensation. It's the dispensation of promise. It's another big step in progressive revelation. I mean, up to now, you're reading through Genesis, nothing like this is happening. This is so brand new. It's almost like, okay, we had the flood, everybody's dead, we had the people get up, hold the Tower of Babel thing. There's the earth is kind of going back to the way it was. God says, okay, I'm going to start over here with Abram. I had Adam, that didn't work out. I'm starting now with Abram. And that's kind of what you get the feeling here. And nearly every major doctrine in the scriptures build off of this covenant. Well, it has 3 important features. And the 3 features of the Abrahamic covenant are land, seed, blessing. So let's talk about the land. You see there in chapter 12, the Lord said to Abram, get out of thy country unto a land I will show you. The land is a promised land given to people chosen by God. The Lord chose Abram, and he gave to Abram this land. Now, there is a command here, and even though I'll say later this is an unconditional covenant, there is still a requirement for Abram. What's the requirement? Well, he's got to go. He's got to leave. He can't stay. He's got to go. In fact, Terah, his father, is not all that interested in leaving. Now, some people believe that actually at this time, there was a warring faction that came down to destroy Ur. So Terah was kind of glad to go, but he really didn't want to go. And so they go part way, they stop, and he dies, he's buried, and then they go, Abram takes them all the way later into the land of promise. Abram is the one who crosses over the river, and that's why he has the name Hebrew. He's the first Hebrew. So Abram is chosen by God, and there are these blessings. I'll make of you a great nation. If you leave, I'll make of you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. And then a second command to be a blessing is followed by this. I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. And I'll even bless the entire world through you. And so these chosen people are given a promised land. Unconditionally, it's theirs. Forever theirs. A chosen people are entering Canaan by divine right. So it's not an invasion. One nation just taking another nation's land. Israel is retaking what God had given to her. And all of that is reinforced in something called the Palestinian Covenant. You get to Deuteronomy and you start to read what Moses writes to the generation. Remember, the first generation, they don't go up. They get all scared. 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad, and 2 were good. Do you remember that? And we sang that as kids. And you have the 40-year wilderness wandering, and now this generation dies off. The younger generation is now ready to go into the land, and the 2 old codgers, Joshua and Caleb, are going to lead them into the land, right? You remember this? And when all of this is going to happen, Moses is dying. He writes out Deuteronomy, the second writing of the law. He writes out Deuteronomy for them, and he says, okay, I'm going to give you this land. That's what God says. And there are all these agreements that God makes with them. You can have the land, and you're going to have houses you didn't build, and you're going to have crops that you didn't plant, and orchards that you didn't plant, and you're going to have animals that you didn't shepherd. And you're going to be in a land flowing with milk. That's animal agriculture, and honey, that's land agriculture. You're going to have all of this incredible wealth and as long as you follow me. But when your heart turns against me, and your heart will turn against me, then I'm going to punish you. And I'll drive you out of the land. He promises them this. It's amazing. He tells them this is what's going to happen. It's all in the Palestinian Covenant. But it's a land promise. And if you read through the Old Testament, even that verse that I've mentioned here on more than one occasion, that verse that's so popular with revivalists, my people called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. I will heal their land. Do you remember that? God will hear from heaven and heal their land. The healing of the land is necessary because the land itself is being harmed by God. That was part of the Palestinian Covenant. God actually is telling the people, if you don't obey me, I'm going to make the land. I'm not going to send rain. I'm going to send blight. I'm going to send bugs. I'm going to send mildew. I'm going to send disease and pestilence. It's going to destroy your land because you're not obeying me. It's an agricultural economy. I'm going to destroy your economy. I will send you a COVID. Okay? Is what he's saying. But if you will repent, then I'll heal the land. See, it's all about the land. And you go through Deuteronomy, and I looked at it today, and I didn't count the number of times the word land is used in Deuteronomy. Let's just say it's a bunch. It's a bunch. So the land promise. And all through the Old Testament, when they go into exile, what do they lose? The land. They're out for 70 years. Why 70 years? Anybody know why 70 years? Because every 7 years, what were they supposed to do? Every 7 years, what were they supposed to do? Right, you guys got it. They're supposed to let the land rest. And they don't do that for how many years? How many years don't they do that? And if you take those years and you multiply them all out, you get to 70 years. God says, fine, you're not going to obey me. I'm going to make the land lay fallow for 70 years. So God actually is just basically doing what he promised them he would do. You can walk through the entire Old Testament and this theme is there. Talking about the Psalms and talking about the land and God's promises and talking about in the prophets and the pre-exilic and the post-exilic prophets. It's all about this land that's there. That's the first idea. Second idea is seed. And this is a promise that Abram would become Abraham. Him is just the plural to be Abraham's, and that wouldn't be right. So it's Abraham. Avraham. Av is the name father, right? Abimelech is father king. Av, it's in English it's A-B, but it's said like A-V, Av. Avraham or Ham, Avraham is father of many. That's what the word means. His name means father of many. Isn't it kind of a joke? Because he's the father of many and he has one son. And it's Ishmael. And then along comes Isaac. It's not really the father of many. It's almost a big joke on this guy. For all of his life, he's got two little boys. And then later on with Keturah, he's going to have other sons. But he's the father of many. And God says, in verse 2, I will make of you a great nation. In fact, when this is restated over in chapter 17, have you all ever noticed this? He says to him, chapter 15. 15. Is it 15? Yes. Oh, look at chapter 15. Look at verse 5. Look toward the heaven and tell the stars if you be able to number them. So shall thy seed be. You're going to have that many offspring. And, I don't know if you've been in a city and tried to see the stars. It doesn't work real well. But in a place where there's no light like that, and you look up on a starry night, and you go out west where there's no light pollution, and the stars are just amazing. You can just see the millions and millions and millions. And scientists now say many of those stars we're looking at are actually galaxies. It's not even a star, it's a galaxy. It's a collection of billions of stars. And he says, it'll be like the sand in the sea. And here's this guy going, but I don't have any kids, and I'm an old man. But God says, I'm going to give you this. I'll make of you a great nation. I love the way Isaiah 51:2, when God called him, he was but one, but God made him many. God made him many. And so Isaac was the seed of promise. You can compare chapter 17 and verse 7 here. Isaac is the seed of promise, at least the initial promise is fulfilled in Isaac. And of course, he has Ishmael, and that's not the fulfillment. And then, of course, later on, Isaac, he's going to have Jacob and Esau, right? And it's not going to be Esau, it's going to be Jacob. And Paul will make a big deal about this in Romans. These non-elect people groups, but it's all going to be about this seed. And then the seed part gets restated in Genesis 49. In fact, go over there and let's look at it. Because you have in this, where Jacob is now blessing, he's now blessing his sons. He's got Judah. He's passed over everybody else. And he says in verse 9, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as an old lion. And who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. Unto him shall be the gathering of the people. Do you see what the promise is here? Is that out of Judah there will become a lion of his tribe. Who's that? It's not Haile Selassie. All right, that's what the Haitians thought in their Rastafarianism religion. It's not Haile Selassie. The lion of the tribe of Judah is Jesus. And the nations are given to Jesus. That's what Matthew 25 is talking about. Jesus isn't just going to rule Israel. He's going to rule the whole earth. All of it. And so the seed part of this Abrahamic covenant then, as you understand it, the seed promise, then fleshes out in the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 16. And I've got all these passages I'm going to walk you through, and we're going to go as quickly as I can, slowly enough that we can understand it, but fast. I'm not going to read them. There's like 8 of them. And these are not simple John 3:16 texts, okay? So we're going to walk through this slowly but steadily. The Davidic Covenant is God's promise to set up David's seed, right? Out of Judah. David is out of Judah. The seed would have his kingdom established. And in the initial fulfillment of the Davidic Covenant is who? Who is that? Who is that? Solomon, right? But the ultimate fulfillment of the Davidic Covenant is who? That's Jesus. And so the promise to David is your kingdom will be established, and I will never take my mercies away from your people, from your family. Now, before the exile, and the exile is coming, and when you have an exile, you're going to immediately go back to this and say, wait a minute, you promised never to take your mercies away. You promised to establish my kingdom. And the Babylonians just took everything and marched off with it. So tell me again what you promised. You lied to me, right? That's how people might feel. So before the exile, you've got people like Jeremiah 23:5 saying that a branch is going to rise up to David, a reference to Messiah, who will execute righteousness and judgment on the earth. And in the right time, in God's time, Judah will be saved. That promise is given, even while Jeremiah is telling people to give up to the Babylonians. And you've got Ezekiel, who by his point in time, God is leaving the temple. The Spirit, the Shekinah, is leaving the temple. And Ezekiel comes along in chapter 37 and says, David will rule the kingdom. By the way, I don't think that's Christ. I actually think David rules on David's throne, but we can argue about that later if you want. But Christ will rule the world. David will rule in Israel, the resurrected David. But you see, David will rule the kingdom. The rules established, and David is separate from God in this text. So there's a promise of David now ruling again. Some people again say that's Christ, but David is never used for a name of Jesus in any of the systematics I've ever read, Reformed or dispensational. I've never seen, old or new, David as one of the names of Jesus. So I think Ezekiel is talking about David. Hosea chapter 3, Israel will be without a king for a long time, and they will start searching for a king like David. And Jesus is that king. And all of that will come in the latter days. So you have this promise in Hosea. And then in Amos, David's kingship will be restored in the future. It'll be repaired, it'll be raised, and it'll be rebuilt. And in fact, it'll even encompass Edom. And who are the Edomites? The descendants of who? Who are they? The descendants of Esau, right? That's down in Petra, if you want to see where the Edomites were. They carved a beautiful city out of the rock there. And some of you have been there. So it's really incredible here what Amos is saying. All of that's before the exile. So you have an exile. You got the Babylonians marching in, right? Well, the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom. The Babylonians march in, and they take everything off captive. In fact, they do it 3 times. And by the last time, they're so fed up with these pesky Israelites, they just destroy everything, raze it basically to the ground, scrape it off the earth. And what do those people have? The psalmist says, they said, sing us a song. And we hanged our harps on the willows. How can we sing the songs of Zion in a strange land? So by the rivers of Babylon we wept. We wept. We couldn't sing those songs anymore because the kingdom's gone. Everything's gone. And we were talking about this morning about how in the heavenly realm and theology and all this stuff, all esoteric, you talk about God's sovereignty and all these things, but in the real world, what it's like, you can have all these promises and you go back in their Tanakh and say, but look what he said to Abraham. And you're going, I don't care, man. My family was just kidnapped. My wife and children are now slaves in a foreign country. They've been given brand new names after the gods of that country, and our temple is destroyed, and our country is gone. What do you have to hang your hat on in that time? What do you have left? All you have are these writings, this promise that God will never let David's house die. He will never let it die. And some people believe that when you get to Jesus and Joseph, that Joseph is the last one. There's nobody left from David's family. Now, it's hard to prove. They got these really thick books where they try to prove it, right? But I think it's a very interesting theory that you get all the way down to Joseph. And clearly at certain times along that lineage in Matthew, it's really sketchy what's going on there. But you get to Joseph, and maybe you're down to just 1 or 2 men left that are of the tribe of Judah from David's family. And then you get a woman and a man, and they're both from David's family in Mary and Joseph. And of course, then you get Jesus. And he is clearly the king. So all of that's happening. And then, of course, time goes by. Daniel's in Persia now. He's an elderly man. He's praying for God to end the exile. Nehemiah is working in the courts of the Persians, and he's praying for the exile to end, for the people to be restored. And you get things like Psalm 89 in verses 34 and 36, where the promise to David is secure, and the seed is everlasting, and the throne is everlasting. And in Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man comes. And the Son is given a kingdom, and it's a multinational kingdom, and the world serves this king, and the kingdom is eternal. And obviously, the Ancient of Days is the Father, and the Son of Man is Jesus. It's the name he would take for himself while he was on earth. And then Zechariah 14, God rules the earth, and this is Jesus in his messianic kingdom. He conquers the wicked. All of that's happening. And you can read about the seed all through. From the time God spoke it to Abraham, you can read about it all through the Old Testament to the very last book. Finally, you have blessing. And this is a short part, so we're almost finished. I'm way over time. But blessing here, it promises that the Messiah will be a blessing to the nations. Back in Genesis 12, I will bless thee and make thy name great. Thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curse thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God's original plan for mankind is accomplished through this family. Abraham is promised a special place of honor, and he has a special place of honor. I mean, he is really, really honored. And his offspring will be divinely protected by God. And through him, the entire world would be blessed. Friends, we're blessed because of Abraham. And in some ways, we are Abraham's seed. That's what Paul says in Galatians chapter 4. We are Abraham's seed. We are, because we are of the right, have the same kind of righteousness of Abraham, who believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. It wasn't the law, it was the faith of following God. You see, ultimately we are blessed through him. And I think all of this is the precursor here for Jesus Christ. I think this is why Jesus can say to the Pharisees, go search the scriptures, in them you find me. Why? You go back into the Tanakh, into that Old Testament, and you find this, and this idea of blessing, it's all through there. There's a one coming. He'll save his people from their sins. He'll redeem, and he'll win the kingdom back, and he'll establish his David's throne, and it'll rule over the earth. All of these promises, to where the disciples are asking him after the resurrection, are you going to do it now? Is it finally time that you're going to do it now? And ultimately, this Abrahamic covenant becomes messianic. It's the basis of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31. And just like the land and the seed have their basis in the Palestinian and the Davidic covenant, here we have the basis in the new covenant in Jeremiah, the new covenant made with Israel, for which we are all beneficiaries. And I conclude by saying, friends, when you read the Old Testament, if you read it this week, just keep in mind what God is doing here. He's revealing himself to you, and he's showing you how he led his people up to the time of Jesus. And that's where we're going to stop. Let's pray.